Hello, the book I have been reading in lockdown is Peter Kay's autobiography. It's called The Sound of Laughter. I decided that I needed to read something a bit lighthearted, something that would make me laugh, and I love Peter Kay. So I'm now going to read you the first chapter from this book. Ding dong, was that the doorbell? You can never be too sure. I didn't get up to answer it. I waited for it to ring again and confirm my suspicions. I waited and I listened. I listened by leaning my head forward and tilting it slightly to one side. Everyone knows that when you lean forward and tilt your head to one side, the volume of life goes up. Ding dong, now that made me jump, even though I was expecting it. Like when I'm staring at my toaster, waiting impatiently for my toast to pop up. When it does, I jump. Every time. Never fails. I've always disliked doorbells. But this has become worse since I got into showbiz. Most people who have experienced success have this fear of getting caught. Found out, the dream is over type fear. My own version of the fear is that the showbiz police have come to take it all back. I imagine them stood at the door in green tights and holding a scroll like those blokes out of Shrek 2. There's two of them. One plays an introductory bugle, the other clears his animated throat. I'm sorry, Mr. K, but I have orders to tell you that you've had a good run, sunshine, but the time has come for you to go back to your cardboard crushing job at Netto supermarket. He puts his hand out. House and car keys, please. But I wasn't enjoying any kind of success when the doorbell rang in 1990. There was a completely different reason for my fear. It was my driving instructor ringing the doorbell, and the time had come for my first ever driving lesson. Raymond was his name. He was a big burly fella, constantly tanned, like a cross between Bully from Bullseye and a fat Des O'Connor. If you can picture that, then I think you need help. It wasn't the first time I'd met Raymond. He'd been my mum's driving instructor a few years before. I'd often seen my mum sat nervously in Raymond's Montego at the side of the laundrette, which was directly opposite our house. Incidentally, ours was a Victorian terrace house, a bit like Coronation Street, but with a posh 4-foot garden at the front. For some reason, every gable end house was a shop. We had a fruit shop at one end of the row, a chippy at the other, Elizabeth's beautiful fish before she moved to Lytham, and directly opposite a TV repair shop and the laundrette. I'd spent my life in that laundrette before we got a washing machine. My mum used to go in 3 times a week with 3 big bags and me in a pram. Apparently, I used to sit in my pram singing Una Paloma Blanca to the women. Years later, me and our Julie used to play tennis up against the gable end of the laundrette during Wimbledon fortnight with the other local kids. That's where Raymond parked up, smoking his pipe. Usually, he'd be snapping at my mum because she was over-revving and couldn't find her biting point. But the advice must have paid off because after 3 attempts, my mum finally passed her test. We never bought a car though, we simply couldn't afford one. Nowadays, my mum won't even consider it. She says there's too much traffic on the roads. So going out in a car was a treat when I was growing up. I can still remember the excitement waiting for my Uncle Tony to swing round the side of the laundrette in his Navy Sierra. Well, if truth be told, he wasn't my real Uncle Tony, but my dad borrowed his orbital sander once, so he was as good as. He was a tall, wiry man with a pencil moustache, a bit anaemic looking. As long as I'd known him, he'd always looked as if he was at death's door, but he's 72 now and still banging on. He'll outlive us all. He'd take our Julie and me out for the day, usually to the seaside, or if it was raining, he'd take us ice skating in Blackburn. I was just happy to be travelling in a car. I was never a big fan of ice skating. I could never get the hang of it. That and the fact it's so bloody slippery on the ice. I also think ice skating rinks are a haven for paedophiles, skating around all day, hanging onto kids' heads, pretending to fall over. They should hang them on the lottery, as my granddad used to say. When the bodies drop, the feet set the balls rolling. I took a girlfriend ice skating once on our second date and I fell and broke my arm in 2 places. Luckily, the whole disaster worked out for the best as the girl took pity on my incompetence and eventually she married me. I hasten to add, there was a 5-year gap between the broken arm and the wedding day. Ding dong. Hold on, I've got to answer this fecking door. I opened it nervously, clutching my provisional. "Hello, Peter. Are you ready, son?" said Raymond. "Suppose so," I said. "Is your mum in?" he said, peering over my shoulder. "Yeah, she's in the backyard bathing the hamster. Mind if I say hello?" And before I could say no, he was halfway down the hall whistling the theme from Deer Hunter. Bloody hell, I wanted to get going. It was costing me £12 an hour for this, and we were already down to £11.50. I could see my mum through the kitchen window. She was in the backyard wearing pink marigolds, struggling to hold the hamster in one hand and prise the top of the Vossine with the other. Our Julie had bought it from the pet shop beside the convent. We'd all been expecting a playful little thing, but as soon as my dad tried to stroke it, it took a chunk out of his wrist. "Oh, the vicious little swine," my dad said as he ran to the medicine cupboard, dripping blood everywhere. After further investigation, our Julie borrowed a book on hamsters from the library. We discovered it was a Russian hamster and that they weren't the friendliest of creatures. I used to hear it moodily thrashing about in its cage, mumbling things in Russian. Often we'd wait to find bits of straw and tiny bottles of vodka strewn all over the kitchen floor. I'm joking, of course. We never had any straw. Anyway, with all the other pets we'd ever owned, eventually it fell victim to the K family curse and dropped dead. When exactly, though, we never knew, because it slept all day and nobody dared go near the vicious little sod, so it could have been dead for weeks. In fact, if it hadn't been for me poking it relentlessly with a biro in the middle of the Brookside omnibus, it might have lain there stiff as a board for months. "Hello, Deirdre," said Raymond. "Have you got yourself a car yet?" "Hello, Ray. Have you got time for a cup of tea?" No, he hasn't got time, I thought, as I shook my head violently and pointed towards the souvenir Pope John Paul II clock on the wall in the kitchen. "I betted not, Deirdre. I've got to take this lad up the bypass," he said, winking at me. I gave him a nervous double take and had a quick check for his wedding ring. "Is it he or a she?" said Raymond inquisitively as he groped towards the hamster. "We've no idea. Nobody's ever got close enough to check because he..." And before my mum could say the word bites, Raymond was leaping around the backyard with the hamster's teeth embedded into his index finger. It was now 10 minutes into my first driving lesson, and I hadn't seen hide nor hair of a steering wheel. When I finally sat in the passenger seat of Raymond's Montego, I couldn't help but stare at his blood-soaked bandage as it dangled over the gearbox. "This is the handbrake, son," he said, with a quiver of discomfort in his voice, as he pointed to the handbrake. I nodded in amazement, but I knew damn well what a handbrake was. I'd seen enough episodes of the Dukes of Hazzard, plus I'd also released a handbrake myself. It was on a milk float at the top of Mercier Street in 1979. We saw it parked on the top of a hill. The milkman was halfway down the street chatting to a woman and showing off his yogurts. "Go on, I dare you," said Jason Mullet. I said I didn't even know what a handbrake was, let alone how to release one. "It's the black stick in the middle," said Troy Moran. "Just pull it down and leg it, I double dare you." "Now hold on," I said. "I might be only 6 years old, but nobody is going to double dare me and get away with it." I checked to see if the milkman was still preoccupied, then climbed into the milk float and delicately released the handbrake. And ever so slowly, the float began to move. I jumped quickly out of the front seat and ran back to my so-called friends. All three of us stood with our mouths open and watched as the milk float advanced down the street, picking up speed and heading towards the milkman. His attention caught by the rattle of 1,000 gold tops, the milkman spun round in slow motion to find a year's wages charging towards him. He let out a high-pitched yelp, you know, the kind a dog makes when you fire an air rifle at its genitals. Or maybe you don't. Dropping his yogurts, the milkman leapt on board the milk float as it shot past him and reached for the steering wheel, managing to turn the float around 360 degrees. I looked on quite impressed with his manoeuvre until I noticed he was now coming up the hill towards us with thunder in his eyes. "Stay there, you little bastards," he shouted. As if I would, we legged it. Well, myself and Troy Moran did, but as Jason suffered from spina bifida, we had no choice but to leave him. He tried his best, but even he couldn't outrun a milk float travelling at 2 miles an hour. So we did what any respectful child of 6 would do in that situation and shopped the lot of us. Later, we were paid a visit by our local Bobby, PC Hassan. He gave me a bit of a talking to, then offered me a Lion Bar when I started to cry. But my dad gave me a clip round the ear when we got home from work. Happy days. Thank God this was the days before the ASBO had been invented. Otherwise, my life could have gone in a completely different direction. And instead of writing this, I could have been learning how to yacht with a bunch of glue sniffers on taxpayers' money. It doesn't sound so bad when you put it like that. So I got off lightly with the milk float incident and hadn't touched a handbrake since. Don't be frightened of it, son. It's only a handbrake, said Raymond. Just push the button in it at the top of your thumb and lower it slowly. Then, slipping the gear stick into first, Raymond finally drove us away.